So just transitioning to the second part of the event, let's start by just taking a step back and saying, okay, all this science, all this technology is great, but what does it mean? What does it enable? So, the Lydian kiosk, if you think about it, is designed to capture the value and the resultant utility of work that's done in the real world using these packets of digital data that we call data assets. This process of assetization, of turning data into data assets with all those features that we just saw, enables some very interesting abilities for data assets, for these pieces of data. So what are these abilities? What abilities does a piece or a quantum of data gain having gone through an assetization process? Well, it lets the manufacturer of the data asset define the rules for interpreting the meaning or the context of the assetized data. It lets the manufacturer define exactly how the data asset can be used or utilized. It lets the manufacturer define the rules for measuring the value of the data asset, the rules for the credit received for each utilization of the data asset, the ability to track, audit, and recall each such utilization of a data asset, and ensure that all rules are being followed, enforced, including credit flowing back for utilizations, and track, audit, and enforce all of these rules independently without having to rely on any central sources of information or authority. So, the question still remains, why should we assetize our data sets and data streams? How can that be valuable to our businesses and to us personally? Before I jump into the exploration of these reasons and some of these bigger picture concepts, I just want to pause and see, just Jennifer, if you had any questions for us before we get into the next section.
No, I don't. And I'm also monitoring the chat and I don't see any audience questions, but I guess this would be a good time to let everyone know that if you do have questions, you're welcome to populate them into the chat box. We're going to save some time for questions at the end, but we'll keep an eye on that. So if something pertinent comes up to the concepts we're discussing and we can weave in an answer, we'll do that at the time.
Fantastic. Thank you. So now, it's time for us to take a step back and look at some of these bigger picture implications that data economics has, starting with, why should we be assetizing our data streams? How can that be valuable to us personally, to our businesses, and so on? Now, unlike physical resources, digital data can be copied and transformed without losing the original raw material. As a result, the same data set can be used as raw materials or as intermediate resources to produce multiple types of revenue-generating data assets. So within a data economy, instead of buying, selling, and licensing data, we can buy, sell, license specific uses or utilities of data that are packaged up as data assets. Now we kind of see how we are able to do that. So as a baseline use case of data economics, consider any data set that a company or an individual is generating, or any data stream that they're generating. We can identify at least 3 major obvious business reasons why every company and individual should consider assetizing the data sets, the data streams that they're generating. The first is the concept of generating multiple revenue streams from the same underlying data sets and the efficiencies that brings to companies. Instead of having to make the binary choice between licensing or selling my data, the producers and owners of this data can instead start designing specific types of data assets as products that can be individually packaged, licensed, sold based on either existing or future possible markets for each of these types of data assets. And the second reason, which follows, is that as a result, this also increases the value of the underlying data set each time a new type of data asset is derived from it. This leads to appreciation first of the value of the digital data itself, and second, the valuation of the companies or individuals who own such data assets. And the implications of that in the short term and the long term are vast. And we are looking at a lot of them very directly through the data economics company. And the third pretty critical business reason is that there is a class of hard problems that has emerged as digital data generated by organizations, individuals, companies has become pretty much ubiquitous. There's a class of business problems that has emerged that is based on sharing data from multiple sources, making them work together, tracking the data utilization that can be actually addressed by data economics with a great deal of efficiency of cost and resources. So the idea of generating answers, shared answers from multiple data sets with proof, this idea that we call a complex invoice, generating such shared answers from data sets when the original data sets themselves may not be shareable. And in health sciences, for example, as you can imagine, that's a very critical scenario. And then tracking the usage and the credit for each utilization of the digital data. These are the classes of hard problems that exist today that data economics can answer pretty elegantly. For example, one of the solutions, as I mentioned briefly earlier, that we are developing with a key partner involves enabling smallholder farms around the world to generate data-backed proof via one of these complex invoice data assets that shows the contribution of each farm in enabling an organic self-certification process and supply chain for a major apparel manufacturer. Now, within this data economy, the farm, the manufacturer, and any regulatory body can independently verify that the crops and the manufactured goods met the organic certification requirements, and also that each farm contributing data to enable this process received due credit without relying on a single source of truth or a governing body. These three reasons to assetize data are the ones that have major implications on how we operate our businesses and use our data today. Data economics also poses some vast implications in the big picture around disciplines such as economics, mathematics, and philosophy. So Jennifer, as our resident expert on these topics and academia in general, what are some of these big picture implications of data economics that you are excited about?
Of course, thanks. Can we flip over to the next slide, please? Great, thanks. And so I'm going to talk about a couple of the implications I'm really excited about that get more into the economics and also some of the policy and maybe philosophy aspects of data economics as a science. So first of all, I'll talk about privacy, auditability, and decentralized ownership of data. So when we start to decentralize data ownership, we're focusing more on those who generate or produce the data. And why this is so exciting, we can democratize the analysis, the ownership, and then the value of that data. So we are really moving from a centralized data set world to a world of going where the data is or going where the data has been generated. And we allow folks to have more ownership over data or enterprise to have more ownership and control over their own data. And I think if you look at data protection and privacy laws such as GDPR, this is almost exactly aligned with the philosophy behind those policies, where the people or the enterprises generating the data maintain control and they maintain a through line of sight or viewpoint through to how that data is being utilized, whether they're utilizing it themselves or whether it's being utilized by other people. And they have a way to control and audit that in a permission sense. The second implication and what that leads to from an economic perspective is that now you have a data economic operating system or framework where the value is not being injected into this system or controlled in this system by some outside entity. So if we go back to the example of the credit card or the airline miles, anytime the airline company can decide to devalue your miles by making a ticket cost a lot more miles, or they can decide to give out free miles, essentially introducing inflation into the system, or they can reduce the supply of the things you can buy with the miles. In a Lydian data economic frame, we're really, or instead of consolidating that power with one entity, we're allowing all of the participants to come to consensus about how those data assets are valued and how the meaningful outcomes are valued within their system. So I think this has some very interesting economic and economic participatory implications when it comes to data. because you can really attach that value to the data that the individual is generating or the company is generating without all of it having to economically pass through another party before you can see value from it. In the third piece, all of this really expands on how we can transact with each other, how we can interact with each other in an economic sense. And really why that is because it allows us to take this very nebulous or sometimes abstract idea of outcomes. And, you know, I come from a healthcare background, so I'll use that idea, the idea of health outcomes. We can also all say, yeah, we all want to have better health. Now, when you say, okay, how do you actually measure that? How do you go from the abstract and ambiguous to something very quantifiable and measurable and trackable? We use digital data to do that. There can be 100 different ways to define a good outcome, and that's okay. We don't all have to agree on exactly what a good outcome is, but we should be able to agree on what are some building blocks to measure any one definition of it. So once we have those building blocks in place and we can describe and share what those outcomes are, that allows us to layer on top of it the definition of the outcome, the financial value of the outcome, and then even financial value above that at a more abstract level of things around how we get to those outcomes, what the processes are, what the individual data elements are. And again, at the end of the day, all of this data is owned and controlled by the people or the entities that generate and produce it as data assets. So that just describes some of the things I'm excited about from an academic economics perspective, but I'll hand it off to Arga to talk about a few more implications, particularly when these data economies start to communicate with each other and interact with each other.
Exactly, and this is definitely the thing that I am most excited about, because this is kind of a very early vision that we all saw, and we've been building the science and the technology towards it. Is, you know, having heard what Jennifer said about this expansion in language and the means of communicating and transacting value with each other, we believe that this was going to eventually lead to the formation of what we are calling the data economic internet. And this may not exactly be called that, but it's an easy way to remember this thing called the InterDNet that we are already seeing the beginnings of. You know, we believe that over the next couple of decades, we're going to see these data economic networks first and foremost forming within various industries, and we're already seeing that. We've seen that over the past 3 years happening, which implement specific solutions and enable different types of data assets and markets to come into existence that use different types of data sources, data streams, and combine them creatively. Then these data economic networks within these industries are going to start connecting with each other and enabling trade and use of data assets across otherwise unrelated companies and organizations within the same sector. And eventually, the data economic networks will, from across industries, will start connecting with each other, as well as with traditional financial systems, to what we call the data economic internet, overlaid on top of the internet, allowing data assets and data asset markets from all over the world to trade with each other. So we're already actually, in fact, seeing this happen across the DNets that the Lydian solutions are implementing. For example, between some healthcare DNets and finance DNets that we are helping implement, with more coming.